Hey everyone, welcome to our corner of Middle-earth. Today, I want to dive into a part of Tolkien's epic that often gets overlooked. The incredible mind games and strategic moves that shape the fate of the free peoples. Even if you've watched the movies or read parts of the trilogy, there's always more to uncover when we look back at what Tolkien wrote. In The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, and even his letters, each detail adds an extra layer of depth to the story we all love. Throughout Tolkien's works, there's this huge emphasis on hope, bravery, and unity. But what makes these stories feel so real is how they balance that sense of hope with the crushing weight of darkness. The war for Middle-earth isn't won by luck. It's won by carefully laid plans, tight friendships, and small acts of courage that end up changing the entire course of history. The way Tolkien describes the courage of each character is something that still resonates with readers worldwide. In this series, we're going to break down some of the key strategies and moments that turn the tide against Sauron. From the final march to the Black Gate, to the sacrifices that no one really expected, each step reminds us that even the greatest evil can be thrown off balance by the right plan. So, let's jump into our first topic, Aragorn's great strategy at the Black Gate. When we talk about Aragorn's leadership, we usually picture him swinging a sword on the battlefield, or rallying allies like the Rohirrim and the men of Gondor. But one of his boldest moves was actually leading a smaller, outnumbered army straight to the gates of Mordor. Based on what Tolkien described, the logic behind this was pretty daring. Force Sauron to fix all his attention on a seemingly desperate attack, and, in doing so, leave the path to Mount Doom a little less guarded. This wasn't just a reckless move. It was a calculated risk. In The Return of the King, there's this sense that every eye of Sauron's forces is glued to the Black Gate. Once Aragorn's host arrives, you can almost feel the tension. Aragorn bets everything on the chance that Sauron will see his army as a direct challenge and forget to keep a vigilant eye on the rest of Mordor. Tolkien mentions in his letters how crucial it was for the Ring-bearer's mission that Sauron was convinced the ring might be with Aragorn. It's such a cool twist that the new king of Gondor actually benefits from being so openly brazen. In the end, this tactic made the Dark Lord pour his resources into crushing Aragorn at the gates, which turned the Black Gate into the ultimate distraction. And yes, the cost was high, but it gave Frodo and Sam the precious time they needed. Instead of looking behind his own walls, Sauron was zeroed in on the challenge right under his nose. That single-minded arrogance set the stage for the ring's destruction and the downfall of Mordor itself. Imagine standing before the massive Black Gate, the very threshold of Sauron's kingdom. In Tolkien's narrative, this final push wasn't just a grand act of heroism. It was fueled by the raw desperation of the free people. At this point, many felt that no matter how things turned out, they had nothing left to lose. In The Return of the King, the whole alliance converges on Mordor's front door, knowing full well that the chances of coming back are slim. This all-in approach was what finally rattled Sauron, who couldn't fathom why such a small force would dare to challenge him so directly. If you look at Tolkien's letters, he points out that Sauron's arrogance kept him from recognizing that his enemies were stalling for time. Sauron believed it was a last desperate gamble, proof that whoever held the ring was bold enough to come knocking at his doorstep. That misunderstanding ended up being his undoing. The emotional impact of this desperate act can't be overlooked. Soldiers from all walks of life stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by the realization that the fate of Middle-earth hinged on a daring distraction. As they confronted orcs, trolls, and other creatures, each moment bought Frodo and Sam a little more time. The Black Gate became a symbol of both hopelessness and hope, showing that even in the darkest hours, unity and courage can force evil to reveal its weakest point. Sauron's biggest flaw was believing he had every outcome under control. In The Return of the King, Tolkien describes how Sauron rarely considered the possibility that anyone would willingly risk everything in a losing battle, especially if they had the ring. It was a blind spot that Aragorn skillfully exploited. By marching right up to Mordor, the Free People set the stage for Sauron's ultimate oversight. He assumed the ring was on the battlefield, not sneaking through his own backyard. Tolkien's letters shed light on Sauron's warped mindset. He was so obsessed with the ring's power that he assumed everyone else would be equally hungry for it. That made him see Aragorn's arrival as a power grab instead of a trick. In reality, the plan was about drawing the eye away from Frodo, who was inching closer to Mount Doom. This decoy effect worked because Sauron couldn't imagine a scenario where people would risk certain defeat without the lure of possessing the ring. The psychology behind it is fascinating because it shows how overconfidence can lead to ruin. Aragorn and Gandalf were well aware that they had little chance of surviving the assault, but they knew it might be enough to keep Sauron occupied. By challenging him directly, they tapped into his pride and forced him to respond with sheer aggression. Every moment he spent focusing on the Black Gate was a moment wasted, allowing Frodo and Sam to slip by unnoticed. Aragorn's march to the Black Gate wasn't just a flashy move. It was a personal sacrifice. In Tolkien's narrative, he put himself and his newly united army at the very center of Sauron's wrath. When we read The Lord of the Rings, it's clear that Aragorn knew this was a near impossible battle, but he also believed that the survival of Middle-earth was worth that risk, even if it meant losing his own life on Mordor's doorstep. The idea of sacrifice is woven throughout Tolkien's works. Aragorn, as the rightful king, felt a duty to protect the lands of men. He led the charge, rallying everyone under a single banner, hoping to inspire unity in a time of darkness. By stepping forward first, he showed Sauron that the Free Peoples weren't broken or divided. It's a powerful moment in the books that reminds us leadership isn't about personal glory. It's about offering yourself for a greater cause. And here's what Sauron failed to see. A leader willing to sacrifice himself isn't playing by the usual rules of power and dominance. Sauron believed Aragorn was after conquest, or maybe even the ring itself. He never grasped the idea that Aragorn's goal was simply to protect others, especially Frodo and Sam. That gap in understanding led Sauron to funnel his resources into this big showdown, while the real threat slipped past him in the form of two hobbits carrying the fate of the world on their shoulders. By the time Aragorn led his forces toward the Black Gate, there were whispers of doubt among the ranks. After all, what chance did a smaller, outnumbered army have against Mordor's legions? Yet in Tolkien's story, this seemingly impossible plan proved to be exactly what was needed. The Black Gate, looming like a giant moor, served as the perfect distraction that kept the spotlight off Frodo and Sam. When you look at Tolkien's letters, you see that he emphasized how each part of the Fellowship had to play its role. Aragorn and Gandalf understood that a diversion was essential for the ring-bearer to have any chance at success. As soon as Sauron believed the ring might be with Aragorn, his focus shifted away from searching his own territory. For all his power, he never guessed that two humble hobbits would be creeping toward Mount Doom without any intention of seizing the ring's might. In the end, this risky plan worked because it combined boldness with careful timing. Even if Sauron had figured out the real goal, it would have taken time to recall his forces and reinforce Mount Doom. That window, however narrow, gave Frodo and Sam the chance to complete their mission. Sometimes the boldest moves are the ones that look most reckless, and Aragorn's decision to face down the Dark Lord at the Black Gate was the perfect example of that. When Aragorn and Gandalf devised their plan, it wasn't just about daring heroics. Their aim was to corner Sauron into a decision he'd regret. By marching to the Black Gate, they forced him to come out swinging, convinced he could wipe out the last major threat to his reign in one decisive blow. That assumption was the trap. Sauron believed he was luring them into his domain, but in fact, he was walking straight into their hands. By directing his days solely at Aragorn's army, Tolkien's writings highlight just how blinded Sauron was by pride. In The Return of the King, you can sense his contempt for any force that dares to challenge him. This arrogance kept him from thinking the free peoples might be playing him at his own game. It's a direct echo of how Morgoth once underestimated his foes in the Silmarillion. Great power can dull your ability to see smaller threats, and that's the key. Sauron was so sure of his might that he overlooked the very real possibility of betrayal from within his own borders. While he piled his armies at the gate, Frodo and Sam crept closer to Mount Doom. Every orc, troll, and Nazgul stationed at the Black Gate was one less enemy patrolling the inside of Mordor. By the time Sauron realized the truth, his greatest mistake had already sealed his fate. When we picture this face-off, it's tempting to see it as a simple clash between two mighty powers. But Tolkien's writing makes it clear that Aragorn wasn't trying to personally defeat Sauron in single combat. Instead, he and the remaining forces of the West stood at the threshold of Mordor to keep Sauron's attention locked on them. Every moment that Sauron spent obsessing over this final showdown was a moment spared for Frodo and Sam. Aragorn's determination here is all about trust. Trust in his allies, trust in the bravery of the armies behind him, and most importantly, trust in the tiny hobbits who were carrying the world's hope. Sauron, blinded by his own power, couldn't even wrap his mind around that kind of faith. He assumed the ring had to be at the gate if his enemies dared to appear so boldly. That's exactly why this confrontation was so vital. It fed Saur's worst assumptions. In the end, the real purpose of Aragorn's stand was never to defeat Sauron in a direct battle. It was to stall him, to bait him, and to give the ring-bearer every precious second possible. Tolkien's letters and notes reveal this was the ultimate gamble, hinging on whether Sauron would take the bait or see through the ruse. Thankfully for Middle-earth, he did just what Aragorn and Gandalf hoped. He went all in on the wrong fight. Every great war has its turning point, and for Middle-earth, the final march on the Black Gate was just that. In Tolkien's writings, it's clear that this wasn't simply about meeting Sauron head-on. It was about orchestrating a moment so critical that it would shift the balance of power. By drawing out Sauron's forces in one concentrated area, the Free Peoples effectively created a window of opportunity for Frodo and Sam, a tiny crack in the enemy's defenses that wouldn't have existed otherwise. What's fascinating is how this strategy tied together the diverse races of Middle-earth. Men, elves, and dwarves weren't just following orders. They were uniting under a single cause. In The Return of the King, you can sense that every soldier who marched toward the gate knew that their role was bigger than personal survival. This unity in the face of overwhelming odds became a backbone of their entire campaign, showing that clever tactics only succeed when everyone stands firm together. Ultimately, the battle at the Black Gate proved that smart planning could outmaneuver brute force. Sauron had the numbers and a fortress of evil at his command. But the Free Peoples had timing, secrecy, and a willingness to sacrifice. The clash might have looked like a desperate gamble on the outside, yet it was a carefully timed stroke of genius on the inside. By the time Sauron realized he'd been outplayed, it was too late. His enemies had already won the war where it mattered most. A lot of people wonder why the all-seeing Eye of Sauron never caught on to the real plan. In Tolkien's narrative, the answer lies in Sauron's inability to understand his enemies' true motives. He assumed that any army bold enough to stand at his gates must have the ring, because that's exactly what he would do if he possessed it. As a result, he dismissed the possibility that the hobbits of all beings could be closing in on Mount Doom. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien suggests that Sauron was too deeply rooted in fear and domination to comprehend selfless actions. This blindness extended to his reading of Aragorn's intentions. Sauron simply couldn't imagine that Aragorn and his allies were willing to risk certain death just to create a diversion. It was an idea that clashed with everything Sauron believed about power and ambition. By the time Sauron even sensed a hint of the ruse, things were already in motion that he couldn't reverse. He had poured most of his forces into defending the gates, leaving Mount Doom vulnerable. And so, the mightiest power in Middle-earth found himself on the wrong side of his own fortress, obsessively battling an army of the ring, while the real threat marched unnoticed through his backyard. In Tolkien's world, the Black Gate stands as the ultimate test of hope against despair. By mustering their last strength and marching there, Aragorn and his allies delivered one final bluff, one that Sauron fell for completely. The presence of such a small force at Mordor's doorstep was so audacious that it practically screamed, "Here is the ring." That was the genius of it. Sauron couldn't see beyond his own obsession. Throughout the Silmarillion and Tolkien letters, you'll find echoes of this theme. Arrogance blinds evil to the selfless motives of the good. While Sauron tightened his grip on the Black Gate, the eye that never sleeps overlooked its own backyard. Frodo and Sam, meanwhile, pushed forward under the weight of the ring, free from the relentless attention of those terrifying, watchful towers. By the time Sauron realized the ring wasn't on the battlefield, everything had already unraveled. His armies were locked in combat with Aragorn's men, and his power was stretched too thin to close off Mount Doom. That's the core of why the Black Gate strategy was so effective. It took Sauron's biggest strength, his confidence in dominating Middle-earth, and turned it into his fatal weakness. Thanks for hanging out and exploring these hidden depths of Tolkien's masterpiece with me. If you enjoyed this breakdown of how the Black Gate became a lethal distraction for Sauron, make sure to subscribe and join our growing fellowship. There's always more to uncover in Middle-earth, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey. Let's keep this conversation going. Drop a comment below about your favorite moment in the War of the Ring. Was it the march to the Black Gate? Or perhaps something else entirely? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how these strategies and sacrifices shaped the final outcome. And if you want to dive deeper into Tolkien world, hit the like button and share this video with friends who might be just as eager to revisit the lore. Together, we can shine a light on even more hidden corners of Middle-earth and celebrate the spirit of unity and hope that Tolkien stories inspire.